Subsection B, Authorization. The destruction of the documents regarding MKUltra made it difficult to determine at what level specific projects in the program were authorized. This problem is not solely a result of the document destruction, however. Even at the height of MKUltra, the IG noted that, at least with respect to the surreptitious administration of LSD, the, quote, present practice is to maintain no records of the planning and approval of the test programs, end quote. Footnote 82. Pausing the reading to read footnote 82. IG Report on MKUltra, 1963, page 14. Resuming the reading. While it is clear that Alan Dulles authorized MKUltra, the record is unclear as to who authorized specific projects, such as that involving the surreptitious administration of LSD to unwitting, non-volunteer human subjects. Even given the sensitive and controversial nature of the project, there is no evidence that when John McCone replaced Alan Dulles as the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, he was briefed on the details of this project and asked whether it should be continued. Footnote 83. Even during the 1963 discussions on the propriety of unwitting testing, the DDP questioned whether it was, quote, necessary to brief General Carter, end quote, the Deputy Director of Central Intelligence, and the Director's, quote, alter ego, end quote, because CIA officers felt it necessary to keep details of the project restricted to an absolute minimum number of people. Footnote 84. Pausing the reading to read the footnotes. Footnote 83. According to an assistant to Dr. Gottlieb, there were annual briefings of the DCI and the DDP on MKUltra by the chief of TSD or his deputy. However, a May 15, 1963 memorandum for the record from the Inspector General noted that Mr. McCone had not been briefed in detail about the program. Mr. McCone's executive officer, Walter Elder, testified that it was, quote, perfectly apparent to me, end quote, that neither Mr. McCone nor General Carter, the then DDCI, was aware of the surreptitious administration project, quote, or if they had been briefed, they had not understood it, end quote. Elder, December 1875, page 13. Mr. McCone testified that he, quote, did not know, end quote, whether he talked to anyone about the project, but that no one had told him about it in a way that, quote, would have turned on all the lights, end quote. John McCone testimony, February 3rd, 76, page 10. Reading footnote 84. According to Elder's testimony, quote, no deputy director, to my knowledge, has ever been briefed or was it ever thought necessary to brief them to the extent to which you would brief the director, end quote. Resuming the reading. In May of 1963, DDP Helms told the Inspector General that a covert testing program was authorized because he had gone to the director, briefed him on it, and, quote, the director indicated no disagreement, and therefore the testing will continue, end quote. Footnote 85. Such authorization, even for non-controversial matters, is clearly less desirable than explicit authorization in areas such as the surreptitious administration of drugs. It is particularly undesirable. Pausing the reading to read footnote 85. IG Memorandum for the record, May 15, 63, on the question of authorization of the covert testing program. Elder testified as follows, quote, but my reasonable judgment is that this was considered to be in the area of continuing approval, having once been approved by the director, end quote. The theory of authorization carrying over from one administration to the next seems particularly inappropriate for less visible, highly sensitive operations, which, unless brought to his attention by subordinates would not come to the attention of the director. Resuming the reading. Yet according to testimony, end of page 406, beginning page 407, before the committee, authorization through lack of agreement is even more prevalent in sensitive situations. Footnote 86. Pausing the reading to read footnote 86. Mr. Elder was asked whether the process of bringing forward a description of actions by the agency in getting approval through the absence of disagreement was a common one. He responded, quote, "It was not uncommon. The more sensitive the project, the more likely it would lean toward being a common practice, based on the need to keep the unwritten record to a minimum," end quote. Resuming the reading. The unauthorized retention of shellfish toxin by Dr. Nathan Gordon and his subordinates in violation of a presidential directive may have resulted from the failure of the director to issue written instructions to agency officials. The retention was not authorized to issue The retention was not authorized by senior officials in the agency. The director, Mr. Helms, had instructed Mr. Karamessines, the deputy director of plans, and Dr. Gottlieb, the chief of the technical services division, to relinquish control to the Army of any chemical or biological agents being retained for the CIA at Fort Detrick. Dr. Gottlieb passed this instruction on to Dr. Gordon. While orders may be disregarded in any organization, one of the reasons that Dr. Gordon used to defend the retention was the fact that he had not received written instructions forbidding it. Footnote 87. Pausing the reading to read footnote 87. Nathan Gordon testimony, September 1675. Hearings, Volume 1. Resuming the reading. In some situations, the existence of written instructions did not prevent unauthorized actions. According to an investigation by the CIA's Inspector General, TSD officers had been informed orally that Mr. Helms was to be, quote, advised at all times, end quote, when LSD was to be used. In addition, TSD had received a memo advising the staff that LSD was not to be used without the permission of the DDP, Frank Wisner. The experiment involving Dr. Olson went ahead without notification of either Mr. Wisner or Mr. Helms. The absence of clear and immediate punishment for that act must undercut the force of other internal instructions and regulations. One last issue must be raised about authorization procedures within the agency. Chemical agents were used abroad until 1959 for discrediting or disabling operations, or for the purpose of interrogations with the approval of the Chief of Operations of the DEP. Later, the approval of the Deputy Director for Plans was required for such operations. Although the medical staff sought to be part of the approval process for these operations, they were excluded because, as the Inspector General wrote in 1957, operational determinations are the responsibility of the DD/P, and it is he who should advise the DCI in these respects, just as it is he who is responsible for the results. It is completely unrealistic to consider assigning to the chief medical staff what in effect would be authority over clandestine operations. Footnote 88. Reading footnote 88. 1957 IG report. Resuming the reading. Given the expertise and training of physicians, participation of the medical staff might well have been useful. Questions about authorization also exist in regard to those agencies which assisted the CIA. For instance, the project involving surreptitious administration of LSD to unwitting, non-volunteer human subjects was conducted in coordination with the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. There is some question as to the Commissioner of Narcotics' knowledge about the project. End of page 407, beginning of page 408. In 1963, the Inspector General noted that the head of BNDD had been briefed about the project, but the IG's report did not indicate the level of detail provided to him. Dr. Gottlieb testified that, quote, "I remember meeting Mr. Anslinger and had the general feeling that he was aware," end quote. Footnote 89. Another CIA officer did not recall any discussion of testing on unwitting subjects when he and Dr. Gottlieb met with Commissioner Anslinger. Pausing the reading to read footnote 89. Gottlieb, October 1875, page 28. Resuming the reading. In a memorandum for the record in 1967, Dr. Gottlieb stated that Harry Giordano, who replaced Mr. Anslinger, told Dr. Gottlieb that when he became commissioner, he was, quote, "only generally briefed on the arrangements. Gave it his general blessing and said he didn't want to know the details," end quote. The same memorandum states, however, that there were several comments which indicated to Dr. Gottlieb that Mr. Giordano was aware of the substance of the project. It is possible that the Commissioner provided a general authorization for the arrangement without understanding what it entailed or considering its propriety. A reluctance to seek detailed information from the CIA and the CIA's hesitancy to volunteer it has been found in a number of instances during the Select Committee's investigations. This problem is not confined to the executive branch, but has also marked congressional relationships with the agency. Subsection C, Internal Review. The waiver of regulations and the absence of documentation make it difficult to determine now who authorized which activities. Moreover, they made internal agency review mechanisms much less effective. Footnote 90. Controversial and highly sensitive projects, which should have been subject to the most rigorous inspection, lacked effective internal review. Pausing the reading to read footnote 90. The IG's report on MKUltra in 1963. Quote, "The original charter document specified that TSD maintain exacting control of MKUltra activities. In doing so, however, TSD has pursued a philosophy of minimum documentation in keeping with the high sensitivity of some of the projects. Some files were found to present a reasonably complete record, including most sensitive matters, while others with parallel objectives contained little or no data at all. The lack of consistent records preclude use of routine inspection procedures and raised a variety of questions concerning management and fiscal controls." End quote. Resuming the reading. Given the role of the General Counsel and his reaction to the surreptitious administration of LSD, Dr. Olson would have it, to Dr. Olson, it would have seemed likely that he would be asked about the legality or propriety of any subsequent projects involving such administration. This was not done. He did not learn about this testing until the 1970s. nor was the General Counsel's opinion sought on other MKUltra sub-projects, though these had been characterized by the Inspector General in the 1957 report on TSD as, quote, unethical and illicit, end quote. Footnote 91. Pausing the reading to read footnote 91. CIA Inspector General's report on TSD, 1957, page 217. Resuming the reading. There is no mention in the report of the 1957 Inspector General's survey of TSD of the project involving the surreptitious administration of LSD. That project was apparently not brought to the attention of the survey team. The inspector who discovered it during the IG's 1963 survey of TSD recalls coming upon evidence of it inadvertently. End of page 408, beginning page 409. Rather than its having been called to his attention as an especially sensitive project. Footnote 92. Pausing the reading to read footnote 92. Even after the inspector came upon it, the IG did not perform a complete investigation of it. It was discovered at the end of an extensive survey of TSD, and the inspector was in the process of being transferred to another post within the agency. Thus, both the General Counsel and the Inspector General, the principal internal mechanisms for the control of possibly improper actions, were excluded from regular reviews of the project. When the project was discovered, the Executive Director, Comptroller, voiced strong opposition to it. It is possible that the project would have been terminated in 1957 if it had been called to his attention when he then served as Inspector General. The audit staff, which also serves in an internal review function through the examination of agency expenditures, also encountered substantial difficulty with MKUltra. When MKUltra was first proposed, the audit staff was to be excluded from any function. This was soon changed. However, the waiver of normal, quote, contractual procedures, end quote, in MKUltra increased the likelihood of, quote, irregularities, end quote, as well as the difficulty in detecting them. The head of the audit branch characterized the MKUltra procedures as, quote, having allowed practices that produced gross administrative failures, end quote, including a lack of controls within outside contractors, which would, quote, assure proper accountability in use of government funds, end quote. It also diminished the CIA's capacity to verify the accountings provided by outside firms. Subsection D, compartmentation and jurisdictional conflict within the agency. As has been noted, the testing and use of chemical and biological agents was treated as a highly sensitive activity within the CIA. This resulted in a high degree of compartmentation. At the same time, substantial jurisdictional conflict existed within the agency between the Technical Services Division and the Office of Medical Services and the Office of Security. This compartmentation and jurisdictional conflict may well have led to duplication of effort within the CIA and to agency policymakers being deprived of useful information. During the early 1950s, the first Bluebird Committee and then Artichoke Committee were instituted to bring together representations of the agency components which had a legitimate interest in the area of the alteration of human behavior. By 1957, both these communities had fallen into disuse. No information went to the Technical Services Division, a component supposedly represented on the Artichoke Committee, about artichoke operations being conducted by the Office of Security and the Office of Medical Services. The Technical Services Division, which was providing support to the clandestine services in the use of chemical and biological agents, but provided little or no information to either the Office of Security or the Office of Medical Services. As one TSD officer involved in these programs testified, quote, "Although we were acquainted, we certainly didn't share experiences," end quote. Footnote 93. Footnote 93, testimony of CIA officer, November 21st, 75, page 14. End of page 409, beginning page 410. Briefly pause. Keltop, another group designed to coordinate research in this area, also had little success. The group met infrequently, only twice a year, and little specific information was exchanged. Footnote 94. Pausing the reading to read footnote 94. The one set of minutes from a Keltop meeting indicated that individuals in the Office of Medical Services stressed the need for more contact. Resuming the reading. Concern over security obviously played some role in the failure to share information. Footnote 95. But this appears not to be the only reason. A TSD officer stated that the Office of Medical Services simply wasn't, quote, particularly interested in what we were doing, end quote, and never sought such information. Footnote 96. On the other hand, a representative of the Office of Medical Services consistently sought to have medical personnel participate in the use of chemical and biological agents, suggested that TSD did not inform the Office of Medical Services in order to prevent their involvement. Pausing the reading to read the footnotes. Footnote 95. When asked why information on the surreptitious administration of LSD was not presented to the Artichoke Committee, Dr. Gottlieb responded, quote, I imagine the only reason would have been a concern for broadening the awareness of its existence, end quote. Footnote 96. CIA officer, November 21st, 75, page 14. Resuming the reading. Jurisdictional conflict was constant in this area. The Office of Security, which had been assigned responsibility for direction of Artichoke, consistently sought to bring TSD operations involving psychochemicals under the Artichoke umbrella. The Office of Medical Services sought to have OMS physicians advise and participate in the operational use of drugs. As the Inspector General described it in 1957, quote, the basic issue is concerned with the extent of authority that should be exercised by the Chief Medical Staff over the activities of TSD which encroach upon or enter into the medical field, end quote. And which are conducted by TSD, quote, without seeking the prior approval of the Chief Medical Staff, and often without informing him of their nature and extent, end quote. Footnote 97. Pausing the reading to read footnote 97. IG Survey of TSD, 1957, page 217. Resuming the reading. As we noted previously, because the projects and programs of TSD stem directly from operational needs controlled by the DAP, the IG recommended no further supervision of these activities by the medical staff. It is completely unrealistic to consider assigning the Chief Medical Staff what in effect would be authority over clandestine operations. Furthermore, some of the activities of Chemical Division are not only unorthodox, but unethical and sometimes illegal. The DDP is in better position to evaluate the justification for such operations than the Chief Medical Staff. Footnote 98, in brackets, emphasis added, in brackets. Pausing the reading to read footnote 98, ibid. Resuming the reading. Because the advice of the Director of Security was needed for, quote, evaluating the risks involved, end quote, in the programs, and because the knowledge that the CIA was, quote, engaging in unethical and illicit activities would have serious repercussions in the political and diplomatic circles, end quote, the IG recommended that the Director of Security be fully advised of TSD's activities in these areas. Even after the Inspector General's report of 1957, the compartmentation and jurisdictional conflict continued. They may have had a substantial, end of page 410, beginning page 411, negative impact on policy making in the agency. As the Deputy Chief of the Counterintelligence Staff noted in 1958, due to the different positions taken by TSS, the Office of Security, and the Office of Medical Services on the use of chemical or biological agents, it was possible that the individuals who authorized the use of chemical or biological agent could be presented with, quote, incomplete facts, upon which to make a decision relevant to its use, end quote. Even a committee set up by the DDP in 1958 to attempt to rationalize agency policy did not have access to records of testing and use. This was due in part to excessive compartmentation and jurisdictional conflict. Subsection C, or Section C. Covert testing on human subjects by military intelligence groups. Material Testing Program EA 1729, Project Third Change, and Project Derby Hat. EA 1729 is the designator used in the Army drug testing program for lysergic acid dithylamide, LSD. Interest in LSD was originally aroused at the Army's chemical warfare laboratories by open literature on the unusual effects of the compound. Footnote 99. The positive intelligence and counterintelligence potential envisioned for compounds like LSD and suspected Soviet interest in such materials, footnote 100, supported the development of an American military capability and resulted in experiments conducted jointly by the U.S. Army Intelligence Board and the Chemical Warfare Laboratories. I'm going to pause the reading to read the footnotes. Footnote 99. USAINTC Staff Study, quote, Material Testing Program, EA 1729, end quote, October 15, 59, page 4. Footnote 100. This same USAINTC study cited, quote, a 1952, several years prior to the initial U.S. interest in LSD-25, report that the Soviets purchased a large quantity of LSD-25 from the Sandoz Company in 1951, reputed to be sufficient for 50 million doses, end quote. In parentheses, ibid, page 16, end parentheses. Generally accepted Soviet methods and counterintelligence concerns were also strong motivating factors in the initiation of this research. Quote, a primary justification for field experimentation in intelligence with EA 1729 is the counterintelligence or defense implication. We know that the enemy philosophy condones any kind of coercion or violence for intelligence purposes. There is proof that his intelligence service has used drugs in the past. There is strong evidence of keen interest in EA 1729 by him, if for no other purpose than to know what to expect from enemy intelligence use of the material, and to thus be prepared to counter it. Field experimentation is justified." End quote. Ibid, page 34. Resuming the reading. These experiments designed to evaluate potential intelligence uses of LSD were known collectively as, quote, Material Testing Program EA 1729, end quote. Two projects of particular interest conducted as part of these experiments, quote, Third Chance, end quote, and, quote, Derby Hat, end quote, involved the administration of LSD to unwitting subjects in Europe and the Far East. In many respects, the Army's testing programs duplicated research which had already been conducted by the CIA. They certainly involved the risks inherent in the early phases of drug testing. In the Army's tests, as with those of the CIA, individual rights were also subordinated to national security concerns. Informed consent and follow-up examinations of subjects were neglected in efforts to maintain the secrecy of the tests. Finally, the command and control problems which were apparent in the CIA's programs are paralleled by a lack of clear authorization and supervision in the Army's programs. End of page 411. Beginning page 412. Subsection 1. Scope of testing. Between 1955 and 1958, research was initiated by the Army Chemical Corps to evaluate the potential for LSD as a chemical warfare incapacitating agent. In the course of this research, LSD was administered to more than 1,000 American volunteers who then participated in a series of tests to ascertain the effects of the drug on their ability to function as soldiers. With the exception of one set of tests at Fort Bragg, these and subsequent laboratory experiments to evaluate chemical warfare potential were conducted at the Army Chemical Warfare Laboratory, East Edgewood, Maryland. In 1958, a new series of laboratory tests were initiated at Edgewood. These experiments were conducted as the initial phase of Material Testing Program EA 1729 to evaluate the intelligence potential of LSD, and included LSD tests on 95 volunteers. Footnote 101. As part of these tests, 3 structured experiments were conducted. 1. LSD was administered surreptitiously at the simulated social reception to volunteer subjects who were unaware of the purpose or nature of the tests in which they were participating. 2. LSD was administered to volunteers who were subsequently polygraphed. And 3. LSD was administered to volunteers who were then confined to, quote, isolation chambers, end quote. These structured experiments were designed to evaluate the validity of the traditional security training all subjects had undergone in the face of unconventional drug-enhanced interrogations. At the conclusion of the laboratory test phase of Material Testing Program EA 1729 in 1960, the Army Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence, a CSI, authorized operational field testing of LSD. The first field tests were conducted in Europe by an Army Special Purpose Team, SPT, during the period from May to August of 1961. These tests were known as Project Third Chance and involved 11 separate interrogations of 10 subjects. None of the subjects were volunteers, and none were aware that they were to receive LSD. All but one subject, a U.S. soldier implicated in the theft of classified documents, were alleged to be foreign intelligence sources or agents. While interrogations of these individuals were only moderately successful, at least one subject, the U.S. soldier, exhibited symptoms of severe paranoia while under the influence of the drug. The second series of field tests, Project Derby had, were conducted by an Army SPT in the Far East during the period from August to November of 1962. 7 subjects were interrogated under Derby Hat, all of whom were foreign nationals, either suspected of dealing in narcotics or implicated in foreign intelligence operations. The purpose of the second set of experiments was to collect additional data on the utility of LSD in field interrogations and to evaluate any different effects the drug might have on, quote, Orientals, end quote. Pausing the reading to read footnote 101. Inspector General of the Army report, quote, use of volunteers in chemical agent research, end quote. March 10th, 76, page 138. End of page 412, beginning page 413. Subsection 2. Inadequate coordination among intelligence agencies. On October 15, 1959, the U.S. Army Intelligence Center prepared lengthy staff study on material testing program EA-1729. The stated purpose of the staff study was, quote, to determine the desirability of EA-1729 on non-U.S. subjects in selected actual operations under controlled conditions. Footnote 102. It was on the basis of this study that operational field tests were later conducted. After noting that the chemical warfare laboratories began experiments with LSD on humans in 1955 and had administered the drug to over 1,000 volunteers, the, quote, background, end quote, section of the study concluded, there has not been a single case of residual ill effect. Study of the prolific scientific literature on LSD-25 and personal communication between U.S. Army Chemical Corps personnel and other researchers in this field have failed to disclose an authentic instance of irreversible change being produced in normal humans by the drug. Footnote 103. This conclusion was reached despite an awareness that there was inherent medical dangers in such experimentation. In the body of this same study, it is noted that the view has been expressed that EA-1729 is a potentially dangerous drug whose pharmaceutical actions are not fully understood, and there has been cited the possibility of the continuance of a chemically induced psychosis in chronic form, particularly if a latent schizophrenic were a subject with consequent claim or representation against the U.S. government. Footnote 104. An attempt was made to minimize potential medical hazards by careful selection of subjects prior to field tests. Rejecting evidence that the drug might be hazardous, the study continued. The claim of possible permanent damage caused by EA-1729 is an unproven hypothesis based on the characteristic effect of the material. While the added stress of a real situation may increase the probability of permanent adverse effect, the resulting risk is deemed to be slight by the medical research personnel of the chemical warfare laboratories. To prevent even such a slight risk, the proposed plan for field experimentation calls for overt, if possible, or contrived through ruse, if necessary, physical and mental examination of any real situation subject prior to the employment of the subject. Footnote 105. This conclusion was drawn on 6 years after one death had occurred, which could be attributed, at least in part, to the effects of the very drug the Army was proposing to field test. The USA INTC staff, however, was apparently unaware of the circumstances surrounding Dr. Olson's death. Pausing the reading to read the footnotes. Footnote 102. USA INTC INTC staff study, quote, Material Testing Program, EA 1729, end quote, October 15, 59, page 4. Footnote 103, IBID, page 4. Footnote 104, IBID, page 25. Footnote 105, IBID. Resuming the reading. This lack of knowledge is indicative of the end of page 413, beginning page 414. General lack of interagency communication on the drug-related research. As the October 1959 study noted, quote, there has been no coordination with other intelligence agencies up to the present, end quote. Footnote 106. On December 7, 1959, the Army Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence, ACSI, apparently a General Willems, was briefed on the proposed operational use of LSD by USA INTC Project Officer Jacobson. In preparation for Project Third Chance, General Willems expressed concern that the project had not been coordinated with the FBI and the CIA. He is quoted as saying, quote, that if this project is going to be worth anything, it, in brackets, LSD, in brackets, should be used on higher types of non-US subjects, end quote. In other words, quote, staffers, end quote. He indicated this could be accomplished if the CIA were brought in. The summary of the briefing prepared by a Major Michalski continues, quote, of particular note is that the ACSI did not direct coordination with CIA and the FBI, but only mentioned it for consideration by the planners, end quote. Footnote 107. After the briefing, 4 colonels, 2 lieutenant colonels, and Major Michalski met to discuss interagency cooperation with CIA and FBI. The group consensus was to postpone efforts toward coordination. Lieutenant Colonel Jacobson commented that before we coordinate with CIA, we should have more factual findings from field experimentation with counterintelligence cases that will strengthen our position and proposals for cooperation. This approach was agreed to by the conferees. Footnote 108. We'll pause the reading to read the footnotes. Footnote 106, IBID, page 6. Footnote 107, Michalski fact sheet, December 9th, 60, page 1. Footnote 108, IBID, page 2. Resuming the reading. Had such coordination been achieved, the safety net of these experiments might have been viewed differently, and the tests themselves might have been seen as unnecessary. Subsection 3. Subordination of individual rights to national security considerations. Just as many of these experiments may have been unnecessary, the nature of the operational tests, polygraph-assisted interrogations of drugged suspects reflects a basic disregard for the fundamental human rights of the subjects. The interrogation of an American soldier as part of the Third Chance 1961 tests is an example of this disregard. The, quote, trip report, end quote, for Project Third Chance, dated September 6, 1961, recounts the circumstances surrounding and the results of the test as follows. In brackets, the subject, in brackets, was a U.S. soldier who had confessed to the theft of classified documents. Conventional methods had failed to ascertain whether espionage intent was involved. A significant new admission by the subject that he told a fellow soldier of the theft while he still had the documents in his possession was obtained during the EA 1729 interrogation, along with other variations of the subject's previous account. The interrogation results were deemed by the local operational authority satisfactory evidence of subject's claim of innocence in regard to the espionage intent. Footnote 109. Pausing the reading to read footnote 109. SBT trip report, Operation Third Chance, September 6th, 61, page 5. End of page 414, beginning page 415. The subject apparently reacted very strongly to the drug and the interrogation, while productive was difficult. The trip report concluded, 1. This case demonstrated the ability to interrogate a subject profitably throughout a highly sustained and almost incapacitating reaction to EA 1729. 2. The apparent value of bringing a subject into the EA 1729 situation in a highly stressed state was indicated. 3. The usefulness of employing as a duress factor the device of inviting the subject's attention to his EA 1729 influenced state and threatening to extend this state indefinitely, even to a permanent condition of insanity, or to bring it to an end at the discretion of the interrogators, was shown to be ineffective. 4. The need for pre-planned precautions against extreme paranoia reaction to EA 1729 was indicated. 5. It was brought to the attention by this case that where subject had undergone extended intensive interrogation prior to the EA 1729 episode and has persisted in a version repeatedly during conventional interrogation, adherence to the same version while under EA 1729 influence, however extreme the reaction may not necessarily be evidence of truth, but merely the ability to adhere to a well-rehearsed story. Footnote 110. Pausing the reading to read footnote 110. Ibid, pages 17 to 18. Resuming the reading. This strong reaction to the drug and the accompanying discomfort this individual suffered were exploited by the use of traditional interrogation techniques. While there is no evidence that physical violence or torture were employed in connection with this interrogation, physical and psychological techniques were used in the third chance experiments to exploit the subject's altered mental states and to maximize the stress situation. Jacobson described these methods in his trip report. Stressing techniques employed included silent treatment before or after EA 1729 administration, sustained conventional interrogation prior to EA 1729 interrogation, deprivation of food, drink, sleep, or bodily evacuation, sustained isolation prior to EA 1729 administration, hot-cold switches in approach, duress, quote, pitches and quote, verbal degradation and bodily discomfort, or dramatized threats to subject's life or mental health. Footnote 111. Pausing the reading to read footnote 111. Ibid, page 13. Resuming the reading. Another gross violation of an individual's fundamental rights occurred in September 1962 as part of the Army's Derby hat tests in the Far East. A suspected espionage agent was given 6 micrograms of LSD per kilogram of body weight. The administration of the drug was completed at 10:35 that morning. At 11:20, sweating became evident. His pulse became threatening. He was placed in a supine position. He began groaning with expiration and became semi-comatose. Footnote 112. Pausing the reading to read footnote 112. Quote, Derby hat, and quote, Medical and Pharmacological Report, Case Number 1, September 20th, 62, page D10-2. End of page 415, beginning page 416. For the next 28 minutes, the subject remained semi-comatose. At 11:48, responses to painful stimuli were slightly improved. At 11:55, he was helped to a sitting position. At 12 o'clock, he became shocky again with return to supine position. At 12:12, he was more alert and able to sit up with help. At 12:20, subject was assisted to interrogation table. At 12:30, he began moaning he wanted to die and usually ignored questions. Rarely, he stated, quote, he didn't know, end quote. At 12:50, his phasic alertness persisted. He frequently refocused his eyes with eyelid assistance. He frequently threw his head back with eyes closed. At 13:30, he was slightly more alert. He was walked for 5 minutes. He physically would cooperate until he became shocky again. Sweating, thready pulse, pale. Footnote 113. Pausing the reading to read footnote 113. Ibid, page D10-3. Resuming the reading. For the next 3 hours, the subject remained in about the same condition. 6 continued attempts at interrogation yielded no relevant answers. 6 hours after receiving the drug, the subject began giving relevant answers to questions. 8.5 hours after the initial dosage, the subject was polygraphed. The interrogation continued for 17.5 hours after the drug was administered. There was some psychological and medical screening of the individuals tested within the United States, in Europe, and in Asia. The proposal for the field experimentation, in fact, called for such examinations. The fact of pre-screening did not eliminate the risk of injury. The availability of medical staff did, however, limit injury and may well have prevented the death of one or more of the subjects. As the medical corps member of the team which surreptitiously administered LSD noted, quote, one subject did collapse after the interrogation, and presence of the medical officer was not only of value to the subject but to the interrogation team, who were thus assured that an unnecessary, untoward result would not occur, end quote. Footnote 115. Pausing the reading to read footnote 115. SPT Trip Report, Operation Third Chance, July 25th, 61, page 1. And as a note, there is no footnote 114. It's only 113 and 115. Resuming the reading. In the October 15, 1959, USA INTC staff study, Moral and Legal Ramifications of Covert Administration of LSD in Field Conditions, were considered. It was always a tenet of Army intelligence that the basic American principle of the dignity and welfare of the individual will not be violated. A more meticulous regard for the prohibition against violence or duress is taken in practice when the suspect is a U.S. citizen or an ally, as against an actual or potential enemy, in peace as against war, and in respect to the nature of the crime. In intelligence, the stakes involved and the interest of national security may permit a more tolerant interpretation of moral and ethical values, but not legal limits through necessity. Any claim, end of page 416, beginning page 417, against the U.S. government for alleged injury due to EA 1729 must be legally shown to have been due to the material. Proper security and appropriate operational techniques can protect the fact of employment of EA 1729. Footnote 116. Pausing the reading to read footnote 116. USA INTC staff study, quote, Material Testing Program, EA 1729, end quote. October 15, 59, page 26. Resuming the reading. On the basis of this evaluation, the study concluded that in view of, quote, the stakes involved and the interest of national security, end quote, the proposed plan for field testing should be approved. The surreptitious administration of drugs is two unwitting subjects by the Army raises serious constitutional and legal issues. The consideration given these issues by the Army was wholly inefficient. The charter of the Army's volunteer testing program and the possibility that drugs were simply substituted for other forms of violence or duress in field interrogations raises serious doubts as to whether national security imperatives were properly interpreted. The quote, consent end quote forms, which each American volunteer signed prior to the administration of LSD, are a case in point. These forms contain no mention of the medical and psychological risks inherent in such testing, nor do they mention the nature of the psychotropic drug to be administered. The general nature of the experiments in which I have volunteered have been explained to me from the standpoint of possible hazards to my health. It is my understanding that the experiments are so designed, based on the results of animals and previous human experimentation, that the anticipated results will justify the performance of the experiment. I understand further that the experiments will only be so conducted as to avoid all unnecessary physical and medical suffering and injury, and that I will be at liberty to request that the experiments be terminated at any time, if in my opinion I have reached the physical or mental state where continuation of the experiments becomes undesirable. I recognize that in pursuit of certain experiments, transitory discomfort may occur. I recognize also that under these circumstances I must rely upon the skill and wisdom of the physician supervising the experiment to institute whatever medical or surgical measures are indicated. In brackets, emphasis added, in brackets. Footnote 118. As another note, there is no footnote 117. It just skips, similar to the previous page. Pausing the reading to read footnote 118. Sample volunteer consent form. Resuming the reading. The exclusion of any specific discussion of the nature of LSD in these forms raises serious doubts as to their validity, and, quote, understanding that the anticipated results will justify the performance of the experiment, and, quote, without full knowledge of the nature of the experiment is an incomplete, quote, understanding, end quote. Similarly, the nature of the experiment limited the ability of both the subject to request its termination and the experimenter to implement such a request. Finally, the euphemistic characterization of, quote, transitory discomfort, end quote, and the agreement to, quote, rely on the skill and wisdom of the physician, end quote, combine to conceal inherent risks in the experimentation and may be viewed as dissolving the experimenter of personal responsibility for damaging after effects. In summary, a, quote, volunteer, end quote, program in which subjects are not fully informed of potential hazards to their persons is, quote, volunteer, end quote, in name only. End of page 417, beginning page 418. This problem was compounded by the security statements signed by each volunteer before he participated in the testing. As a part of this statement, potential subjects agreed that they would not divulge or make available any information related to U.S. Army Intelligence Center interest or participation in the Department of the Army Medical Research Volunteer Program to any individual, nation, organization, business, association, or other group or entity not officially authorized to receive such information. I understand that any action contrary to the provisions of this statement will render me liable to punishment under the provisions of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Footnote 119. Pausing the reading to read footnote 119. Sample volunteer security statement. Resuming the reading. Under these provisions, a volunteer experiencing after effects of the test might have been unable to seek immediate medical assistance. This disregard for the well-being of subjects' drug testing is inexcusable. Further, the absence of any comprehensive long-term medical assistance for the subjects of these experiments is not only unscientific, it is also unprofessional. Subsection 4. Lack of normal authorization and supervision. It is apparent from documents supplied to the committee that the Army's testing programs often operated under informal and non-routine authorization. excuse me, potentially dangerous operations, such as these testing programs, are the very projects which ought to be subject to the closest internal scrutiny at the highest levels of the military command structure. There are numerous examples of inadequate review, partial consideration, and incomplete approval in the administration of these programs. When the first Army program to use LSD on American soldiers in, quote, field stations, unquote, was authorized in May 1955, the Army violated its own procedures in obtaining approval. Under Army Chief of Staff Memorandum 385, such proposals were to be personally approved by the Secretary of the Army. Although the plan was submitted to him on April 26, 1956, the Secretary issued no written authorization for the project, and there is no evidence that he either reviewed or approved the plan. Less than a month later, the Army Chief of Staff issued a memorandum authorizing the tests. Footnote 120. Pausing the reading to read footnote 120. Inspector General of the Army report, quote, use of volunteers in chemical agent research, end quote. March 10, 76, page 109. Resuming the reading. Subsequent testing of LSD under Material Testing Program EA 1729 operated generally under this authorization. When the plans for this testing were originally discussed in early 1958 by officials of the Army Intelligence Center at Fort Holabird and representatives of the Chemical Warfare Center at Edgewood Arsenal, an informal proposal was formulated. This proposal was submitted to the Medical Research Directorate at Edgewood by the President of the Army Intelligence Board on June 3, 1958. There is no evidence that the plan was approved at any level higher than the President of the Intelligence Board or the Commanding General of Edgewood. The approval at Edgewood appears to have been issued by the Commander's adjutant. The medical research laboratories did not submit the plan to the Surgeon General for approval, a standard procedure, because, end of page 418, beginning page 419. The new program was ostensibly covered by the authorizations granted in May 1956. Footnote 121. Pausing the reading to read footnote 121. Ibid. Pages 135, 137, and 138. And I will stop here for this recording.